On the 1st of December 2013, 2,000 dead mice fell from the sky over a jungle island in the Pacific. Not in a movie, not a drill, an actual U.S. government operation. Each mouse was strapped to a small cardboard parachute hand-assembled, timed, and dropped from helicopters at precise intervals over the forests of Guam. Some of them even carried tiny radio transmitters. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a prank. It was a calculated strike against a snake. But before we get to the mice, we need to understand how a small Pacific island ended up with a snake problem this severe in the first place. The brown tree snake is not native to Guam. It's believed to have arrived sometime after World War II, most likely hidden inside military cargo, on a ship, or in the hull of an aircraft moving through the region. No one brought it intentionally. It just got there. And that's where the story gets complicated. Because the problem wasn't simply that a snake showed up. The problem was where it showed up. Guam is not a continent. It doesn't have the layered, self-correcting ecosystems that large landmasses build over millions of years. It's a closed system 31 miles long, 6 miles wide with far less ecological buffer. When a new predator enters that kind of environment, there's very little to absorb the impact. The birds on Guam hadn't evolved alongside a climbing, nocturnal predator like the brown tree snake. They had no instinct to avoid it, no behavior built in to protect their nests from something that could follow them into the canopy. So when the snake began to spread, it didn't just survive. It found an environment that was almost perfectly designed for it to take over. 3 factors made this invasion move faster than almost anything wildlife managers had seen before. First, almost no natural predators. On Guam, the brown tree snake faced very little biological pressure keeping its numbers in check. Second, an abundance of easy prey. Birds, eggs, hatchlings, lizards, small mammals. The forest was, for this snake, an open buffet. Third, nowhere to escape. On a 31-mile island, when a species expands its range, it doesn't take long before it has reached everywhere. The prey populations had no space to recover, no refuge zones, no edges of the island left untouched, no natural enemies, unlimited food, a contained landscape with no exit. When a predator finds that combination, it doesn't stabilize at a manageable level. It multiplies until the food supply can no longer support it, and by then, the damage to the ecosystem has already been done. Now, the easy assumption is that losing birds just means a quieter forest, fewer songs, fewer feathers, less color in the canopy. That's not what happened in Guam. According to the USGS, the brown tree snake's impact on Guam's native bird population was not a gradual decline. It was near total collapse. Of the 12 native forest bird species that once lived on the island, 10 have disappeared from Guam entirely. Not reduced, not endangered in isolated pockets, gone from the island. That's not a 10 or 20% loss. That's the functional erasure of an entire bird community from a living forest. But here's where the story gets stranger. When researchers began comparing Guam's forests to nearby islands, places like Saipan, where bird populations remained intact, they found something that took a moment to process. The forests of Guam had spider populations that were estimated to be up to 40 times larger than those on neighboring islands. 40 times. Not because something was feeding the spiders, not because conditions on Guam were uniquely favorable for spider reproduction, but because the birds were gone. Forest birds are not just animals that happen to live in trees. They are active regulators. They eat insects. They eat spiders. They keep a ceiling on populations that would otherwise grow without limit. When you remove that pressure, not just reduce it, but remove it almost entirely, what was once held in balance starts to expand. The snakes didn't need to target spiders. They never touched them. But by eliminating the birds that controlled the spider population, the snakes reshaped the forest anyway. That's what ecologists call a trophic cascade. One change at one level of the food web sends ripples in directions that have nothing to do with what the predator was actually hunting. The snake ate birds. The spiders multiplied. The forest reorganized itself around an absence. That's the part most people don't think about when they hear invasive species. They imagine a predator eating its way through prey, a direct line from hunter to victim. But ecosystems don't work in straight lines. They work in webs. And when you pull out one thread, especially a thread that was doing invisible work, the whole structure shifts. The brown tree snake didn't need to eat spiders to change their numbers. It just had to make the birds disappear. The obvious question at this point is, why not just set traps? It's a fair instinct. You have a snake problem. You identify where the snakes are. You place traps. You remove them one by one. That logic works under specific conditions. When the target area is small, when the animal moves in predictable patterns, when the numbers are manageable enough that ground-based methods can keep up. None of those conditions applied to Guam. The brown tree snake is nocturnal. It moves through the forest canopy at night, along branches and through dense vegetation that ground-level traps can't reach. A single trap controls a single point in space, and when you're dealing with a species that some U.S. wildlife documents estimated at densities as high as 13,000 snakes per square mile in Guam's forests, placing traps manually becomes a calculation that simply doesn't scale. You would need more traps than people, more people than the island has space for, and you'd still be working at ground level while the snakes stayed in the trees. But the problem didn't stay in the forest. Between 1,978 and 1,997, Guam recorded more than 1,600 power outages directly linked to brown tree snakes, an average of roughly 85 outages per year. In some periods, that number climbed toward 200 per year. Snakes were climbing electrical infrastructure, causing short circuits, bringing down power to homes, hospitals, and businesses across the island. The estimated economic cost of those outages, equipment damage, operational disruptions, emergency response ran to approximately $4–5 million per year. This was no longer just an ecological crisis. It was an infrastructure problem, a public safety problem, a problem that cost money every single year and showed no sign of slowing down. Traps still had a role. Detector dogs trained to find snakes at ports and cargo facilities helped prevent the snake from spreading to other islands. Inspection protocols added a layer of defense at the border. These tools mattered, but they couldn't reach inside the forest. They couldn't cover the canopy. They couldn't move fast enough across terrain that stretched across an entire island. A trap works when you can predict where the target will be. The brown tree snake climbed at night, disappeared into the forest at dawn, and operated across terrain that no ground team could monitor at the density needed. So the question shifted, not how to catch the snake where it slept, but how to bring something to the snake where it actually hunted. So let's go back to the image from the beginning. 2,000 dead mice, cardboard parachutes, helicopters flying low over the forest canopy. When most people first hear this, the parachutes are the part that seems absurd, almost theatrical, like someone added an unnecessary detail just to make the story more memorable. But the parachutes were not decoration. They were the solution to a very specific problem. The brown tree snake is a canopy hunter. It lives and moves through the upper layers of the forest along branches, through dense foliage, high above the forest floor. When it hunts up there, not on the ground. This created a delivery problem. If you simply drop a mouse from a helicopter with no parachute, it falls straight down, fast, and it lands on the ground exactly where the snake is least likely to encounter it. The bait would be in the wrong layer of the forest entirely. The cardboard and tissue paper slowed the descent just enough, not to keep the mouse airborne for long, but to give it a chance to catch on a branch, to lodge in the canopy, to end up suspended at the level where the snake actually moves, feeds, and hunts. The parachute wasn't a quirky visual choice. It was a targeting mechanism, and the operation itself was built with the precision that detail implies. According to documentation from the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the 2013 aerial bait drop was not a one-time scatter of mice across random forest. Scientists designated treatment zones of approximately 55 hectares each. They set up control areas of the same size, roughly 55 hectares, that would receive no bait, allowing researchers to compare snake activity between treated and untreated forest over a monitoring period of 16 months. That's not an airdrop. That's a controlled field experiment conducted from the air. Every mouse placed on a parachute, every drop timed and sequenced. Specialists inside the helicopters releasing the bait in deliberate intervals, not at random. The goal wasn't to flood the forest with dead mice and hope for the best. The goal was to place each piece of bait at the right altitude, in the right zone, at the right density, so that a snake moving through its natural hunting territory would encounter it. The cardboard parachute is the part of this story that makes people laugh when they first hear it, but it's also the part that makes the whole operation scientifically coherent. They weren't dropping mice into a forest. They were placing bait directly into the layer of space where the snake lived. Now we get to the part that makes the whole operation strange in a way that actually matters. The mice weren't just bait. Each one had been treated with acetaminophen, the active ingredient in one of the most common pain relievers in the world. The kind of thing sitting in medicine cabinets in virtually every household. A substance so familiar that most people don't think twice about it. But here's what makes this worth paying attention to. Every species processes chemicals differently. What a human body handles at a standard dose can interact with another animal's biology in a completely different way. The compound isn't inherently safe or dangerous in the abstract. It depends entirely on the organism receiving it. For the brown tree snake, acetaminophen interferes with the body's ability to transport oxygen through the blood. When that process is disrupted, oxygen can't reach tissue the way it normally would. The snake's body begins to fail not from a wound, not from a trap, but from a metabolic breakdown triggered by a chemical that millions of people take for headaches. A very small amount is enough. That's the detail that researchers identified and that made this approach viable. The brown tree snake is unusually sensitive to acetaminophen. While other species would need to consume far more of a toxic substance before it became dangerous, this particular snake crosses a critical threshold at a dose small enough to be delivered inside a single dead mouse. The selectivity matters. It means the bait could be designed to be lethal to the target species without requiring quantities that would pose the same risk to other wildlife at comparable exposure levels. This wasn't a poison applied broadly. It was a compound matched to a specific biological vulnerability in a specific species. And the reason scientists knew to look for that vulnerability, the reason acetaminophen ended up in the mouse and not something else, came from years of toxicological research into how different reptile species metabolize chemicals. The brown tree snake's particular sensitivity wasn't assumed. It was tested, documented, and then applied at scale. So the full picture looks like this: a mouse, a cardboard parachute, a helicopter, a forest canopy, and inside that mouse, a compound chosen not because it was exotic or powerful in the conventional sense, but because it matched a precise biological weakness in the animal it was meant to reach. What humans reach for when they're in pain turned out to be exactly what the brown tree snake's body couldn't handle. The weapon was in the medicine cabinet the whole time, but knowing what to put in the mouse and where to drop it was only part of the equation. There was a third constraint, one that doesn't get mentioned as often, but shapes everything about how the operation had to run. The bait had a window. In Guam's tropical climate, conditions are hot and humid year-round. Under those conditions, a dead mouse deteriorates quickly. The scent that makes it attractive to a hunting snake, the same scent that draws the animal toward the bait in the first place, begins to fade within roughly 2 to 3 days after the drop. After that window closes, the bait is no longer effective in the way it was designed to be. It may decompose further. It may lose its appeal. It may attract other scavengers instead of the target species. That constraint changes the entire logic of the operation. If each piece of bait has an effective window of roughly 72 hours, then timing isn't just a detail, it's the core variable. A drop that happens too early in the wrong weather conditions, or in an area where snake activity is lower than expected, loses most of its potential before the target even encounters it. Every hour past the optimal window is a fraction of effectiveness that can't be recovered. This is why the campaign couldn't be reduced to a simple equation of more mice equals more results. The correct number of mice matters, but so does the correct forest zone, the correct altitude in the canopy, the correct timing relative to snake movement patterns, the correct sequence of drops across treatment areas to maintain coverage before any individual bait degrades. Each of those variables had to be right simultaneously, not approximately right. Right enough that a snake moving through its territory at night, following scent, would encounter a piece of bait that was still within its effective window, still positioned correctly, still carrying the compound at sufficient concentration. The operation looked simple from the outside: helicopter, forest, dead mice. But underneath that image was a logistics problem with a hard deadline built in from the moment each mouse left the aircraft. The right bait, the right place, the right time. Miss any one of those, and the window closes before the target arrives. So what actually happened after the mice came down? The aerial bait drop showed measurable results in the treatment zones, particularly in dense forest areas where ground-based trapping was difficult or impossible to scale. In those targeted sections, snake activity declined. The compound reached its intended target, but the brown tree snake did not disappear from Guam. And anyone who understood the scale of the problem would not have expected it to. Consider what the island was still dealing with: Over a 20-year period from 1978 to 1997, snakes caused more than 1,600 recorded power outages, an average of roughly 85 per year, climbing toward 200 inches some periods. The estimated economic damage from electrical failures, equipment loss, and operational disruption ran to approximately $4–5 million annually. A species that had embedded itself that deeply in the forest, in the infrastructure, across decades was never going to be removed by a single campaign. No one claimed it would be. What the aerial operation represented was something more specific, a method of reaching snake populations in terrain that conventional tools couldn't access. Not a solution that ends the problem, a tool that reduces it in places where other tools fail. That distinction matters because it changes how the campaign should be evaluated. The measure wasn't whether Guam woke up snake-free after December 2013. The measure was whether the bait reached the right layer of the forest, whether snake numbers dropped in treatment zones compared to control zones, and whether the approach could be refined and repeated. But there was something else. The campaign demonstrated something that went beyond the results of that particular drop. It showed that controlling an invasive species didn't have to mean chasing it one individual at a time. It could mean studying how the animal moves, where it hunts, what it eats, how its body processes specific compounds, and then building an intervention around the exact points where the species is most vulnerable. The shocking part wasn't that the snakes vanished overnight. The shocking part was what it took to move the problem even a fraction. A precise understanding of canopy height, bait degradation timelines, tropical climate conditions, and the specific metabolic weakness of one reptile. To address a snake, you had to think like the forest. Here's what this story actually contains. Once you step back from the image of mice falling from helicopters, a 31-mile island, an estimated 2 million brown tree snakes, densities in some forest areas documented as high as 13,000 snakes per square mile, 10 of 12 native forest bird species gone, spider populations in Guam's forests estimated at up to 40 times the levels found on nearby islands where birds survived, more than 1,600 power outages over a 20-year period, approximately $4–5 million in economic damage every single year. And in December 2013, 2,000 dead mice dropped from helicopters into the forest canopy as one attempt to push back against a problem that had been building for decades. Each of those data points connects to the next. The snake arrived. The birds disappeared. The forest shifted. The infrastructure failed. The solution had to reach where no trap could go. When the story first surfaces mice on parachutes, helicopters over jungle, a U.S. government operation, that sounds like a prank. The instinct is to file it under weird facts. Something to share, something to laugh at, something to move past. But the more clearly you see each piece, the less strange it looks. The parachutes were targeting. The acetaminophen was a biological match. The 72-hour window was a constraint that shaped every logistical decision. The helicopter was the only tool that could reach the canopy at scale. None of it was random. None of it was dramatic for the sake of drama. It was a problem genuinely difficult, genuinely large, met with a solution built from the specific details of how one species lives, moves, eats, and fails. The mice falling from the sky were just the most visible part. The real story was everything underneath them.